So St. Maximilian, right, at the heart of it, like I said, he was devoted to the Blessed Mother, and gave his life in Auschwitz, but he had to live his whole life training his heart, to be able to make that sacrifice. It's not like St. Maximilian, like Luke was saying, it's not like St. Maximilian was born able to give his life to another person. He had to make decisions and choices all along the road. And so St. Maximilian was born January 8th in 1894, so the end of the 19th century. And when he was born in present-day Poland, but it was actually Russian-occupied Poland at the time. So he was actually surrounded by Russian government growing up, and Russian language, and just kind of Russian systems. In fact, a lot of people, there were still some Russian Orthodox, but for the most part in that area, they were Roman Catholics. And that was actually a very cultural thing for them, and an identity also to them was being a Roman Catholic. When he was a little boy, like many people, both his parents had to work. Sometimes we forget nowadays, especially middle-class America, that mom being able to stay home and watch the kids is actually a huge privilege. That most of history, the mom had to work. And so St. Maximilian was no exception. Early 20th century, his mom and his dad were both basket weavers, and the mom was also a midwife. And so St. Maximilian, even as a little guy, would go home, 9 years old, make dinner. He was basically a latchkey kid. But at one point, around that age, 8, 9 years old, he was misbehaving, and his mom said, "What is going to become of you?" And he must have been born with an inquisitive mind, because he took that very seriously. And he went to the church, St. Matthew's nearby, and he kneeled in front of Our Lady, and he asked her, "What is going to become of me?" And we don't know, because we only have the story secondhand. 8-year-old Raymond was his birth name, 8-year-old Raymond telling his mom, and then his mom, 50 years later, telling the world, Our Lady appeared to him and offered him 2 crowns. And she told him the red one was for martyrdom and the white one was for purity. And so he said he chose both of them. And from that moment, he actually started trying to be good, because he wanted to make sure that however God willed, he would get that red crown. And he wanted to make sure that he kept the white crown, right? Yeah. And he was very smart. And so he didn't tell anybody about these crowns, but found out about it after his death. He was very smart, and by God's providence and through a benefactor, he was able to be educated. And eventually he went to the minor seminary. To go to the minor seminary in a Roman Catholic, he had to go clandestine in a truck with hay to the minor seminary in Austrian-occupied Poland. And he and his brother studied there, and that was a huge thing. They were probably 12, 13 years old. And he really didn't know if and when and how he was even gonna ever, get back home. He just knew he was gonna go to the seminary and hopefully do God's will and keep that white crown. He did very well, and so they wanted to send him to Rome to study, and he didn't want to go because he was afraid of the women. He thought that the women were going to attack him basically, and tempt him and flirt with him and be scandalous, and so he said no. And then later on he realized, maybe I'm not doing God's will. I'll go back and tell them I'll do whatever they want. And they're like, "You're going to Rome." So he went to Rome. In one of his first letters back home, he writes that the women are very nice. So he wasn't scared of them anymore. St. Maximilian, when he was in Rome, he got 2 doctorates. He became a priest. He had a very sensitive heart. almost, you might say, to a fault. He was very, very, very scrupulous, where he thought that every little thing he did that wasn't perfect was a terrible sin. And he thought that he was always offending God. And he saw fire and brimstone everywhere. The point that his spiritual director had to basically forbid him from going to confession.
Oh, wow.
And tell him that anytime he had these obsessive thoughts, because scrupulosity is kind of like religious obsessive compulsive, like an obsessive thing. Not necessarily, but some people who have OCD, who are religious, many will also have scrupulosity. But anyway, that anytime he started having these obsessive thoughts about his sins, he had to tell his spiritual director, this mentor. So that helped him a lot. But for instance, one time they were out on a walk and he said to his friend, "You did ask permission, right?" And his friend jokingly was like, "No." Well, St. Maximilian, here he is, a young man, you know, educated, close to Christ, and he starts crying. Like, "You didn't tell? You didn't ask permission? Oh no." And so he's just very almost emotional and sensitive. And so he struggled with this, and it was really a cross to try and I think that struggle that he experienced in Rome is partly why St. Maximilian does actually focus on the love of God and conversion of sinners for their happiness and their holiness, more than because they're going to hell if they don't convert. You know, he was actually geared more towards love, even though sometimes the fire and brimstone kind of showed up. So he was already becoming very successful. Again, 2 doctorates by the time he was 24. He was a priest. And he also began what is called the MI, which is a movement that still exists. It's got millions of people in it. Sadly, to be honest with you, it's not as organized as it probably would be if St. Max was still alive, but it still exists and it's beautiful. And the International Center is still in Rome. There's a national office in Illinois.
What was it called again?
It's called the MI. It's short for Militia Immaculata, which is the Army of Mary. And it's made up of people who are consecrated to Our Lady with the mission to do exactly what you were talking about, with the mission of uniting yourself to Christ in order to bring people to him, to offer every little thing, your day at work, your suffering, whatever it is, to Our Lady in order to spread the kingdom of Jesus. So poor St. Maximilian, he started this thing with 7 people, 1 priest, I think, and seminarians. And it was the year of the Spanish flu, 1917. And so 3 of the founding members are young men, and they died of the Spanish flu in the first year. And he was diagnosed with tuberculosis and sent to a hospital in the mountains and told that he wasn't allowed to work on it. So, but he entrusted it all to Our Lady. So then St. Maximilian did go back to Poland. He continued to work on the MI and its mission. He was teaching at the seminary, but because his lungs were so weak from tuberculosis, he could barely raise his voice. And they called him molasses because he was slow and sweet. So he didn't really excel as a teacher. So he ended up getting moved. And he started a journal, a magazine. The initial print was in January 1922, and it had a press run of 5,000. Okay? And he was doing this out of his little friary. This is where the success part comes in. 15 years later, there was only one of about 5 different magazines, and just this one had a press run of 1 million.
Oh, jeez.
1
Yeah,
million.
St. Mag.
And you know, the population of Poland was probably like 20 some million. I mean, it wasn't huge. He was reaching a huge percentage of the population.
5%, yeah.
In 1927, they were outgrowing the friary and people were becoming suspicious of him, and they thought he was going to try and start another order. And he's like, no, he loved being a Franciscan, but he did get permission to start a friary. And that friary, it was great. He needed this land, but they had no money. So he put a statue of Our Lady on it and asked the guy who owned it, a prince, to give it to them. And the prince laughed. So they left the statue there and went home. And the prince, within a matter of days, called and was like, okay, fine, you can have it. He did that kind of thing a lot. One time they were short money, a specific amount, and he went into the church and there was a envelope of money and it was the exact amount that they needed. So he got permission from his superiors to use it to pay his bills. So this friary went again from a group of about, 10 or 12. And at the height of the friary, which was just prior to World War II, when everybody started to disperse, it had over 700 people in it. And it had like dozens, I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, it had dozens of people in formation, and it had a seminary specifically or formation house specifically for mission. They wanted, because he dreamt of he talks about sending people to India, the United States, Asia, other places in Europe, etc. Before World War II, St. Maximilian also got permission to go to Japan. And he'd walk into the office and ask permission, and they'd say no. And he kept doing it every day or however often. And so finally they're like, look, if you come through that front door again, it's going to be no forever. And so the next time he came, a few days later, he went in the back door.
Oh my gosh.
That's funny.
And so they're like, all right, fine. Well, how are you going to pay for it? Our Lady's going to pay for it. Well, what are you going to do? Our Lord's work. Well, who's going to go with you? So-and-so. What about your health? It'll be okay. And for some reason they let him go. He first tried Singapore, I think, somewhere in China. And I don't remember the details, but it didn't go over real well. So they ended up going to Nagasaki, which was the Catholic stronghold of Japan. And there they said, no, you can't stay. But it came out in the conversation. They were talking Latin, actually, the Bishop of Nagasaki and St. Maximilian. Speaking Latin, it came out that they needed a professor. So St. Maximilian's like, oh, by the way, I have 2 doctors. And they were like, all right, you can stay. So he ended up getting to stay in Nagasaki. And where they built the friary ended up surviving the atomic blast, and it became an orphanage. And he suffered tremendously in Poland. Tremendously. From reading his writings, it sounds like it may have been the place he suffered most. The weather just wreaked havoc on his health, the food, the language. I mean, he was very smart. They were the first Europeans to typeset in Japanese. They landed in Japan, and within a month, they published a magazine.
What the heck?
I know.
Jeez.
I know. This guy's amazing. Like, he's just crazy. And they learned the hard way how to do things, like, if I remember well, you weren't supposed to just like give away stuff. That was like insulting. You had to either request their card, and if they gave you the card, then that was permission to give them stuff. So they had to learn the hard way, cultural things. But they persisted, and the friary actually still exists. Poor Saint Max, because his health was so terrible, he actually ended up getting brought back to Japan. And the man who used to cry at the drop of a hat, from what it sounds like, I mean, obviously I'm making assumptions, and I'm sure a Polish man didn't cry really that much, especially expressing it. But leaving Japan, he said, in his writings, he talks about how something moistened his eyes as he pulled away. He had hoped to leave his bones in Japan. He had hoped to die, you know, a martyr in the missions. So he got brought back to Poland, and they began a radio in 1938. And then in September 39, the Nazis invaded Poland. And also in September 39, he was arrested. People don't realize he was actually arrested twice. This first, but he was erased. He was released, and he was released on December 9th. He went home. He got permission, and they actually did one more magazine. And in the magazine, it had Our Lady on the front, of course. And the article that St. Maximilian wrote was about truth, and about how truth was powerful and that nobody could change truth. And he talked all about the truth of Christ. And so people speculate that the Nazis weren't too happy with his article. You know, St. Max didn't try to annoy the Nazis, like he played by their rules.
To some degree,
He got them to do things like they were able to keep it open because they accepted hundreds of Jewish refugees. So he would do things that he knew they would like in order to keep the friary going. Obviously nothing that was ever wrong, but still. But then when it came time to speak the truth, he spoke it.
Yeah.
Certain people were probably more willing to listen to him because they saw that he wasn't fighting for fighting's sake or fighting out of fear, which I think is what fosters the extreme so often, is that fear. If I let go a little bit, everything's gonna get lost. Evangelization in the spirit of St. Maximilian, a lot of people will forget because they know how pro Our Lady he was, how he talks about the conversion of sinners, how he talks about the presence of hell, how he talks about suffering, how he talks about all these things. And he offered, and you know, we know that when he was in jail, and we can assume that when he was in Auschwitz, he was offering for the conversion of the Nazis. We know that he prayed for them, but he didn't straight out go to the Nazis and give them Catholic lessons when they came to the friary.
Yeah.
He knew they weren't going to listen if he just started talking to them about, you know, all the things that they were doing wrong.
Mhm.
So he brought them to the chapel. He showed them, look, this is Jesus. He did that kind of thing, but it wasn't aggressive. And like his friend in the prison, the Protestant, he was very clear that he was Catholic. He prayed his rosary with his friars. He talked about Our Lady. When he wrote the letter to his mom, he talks, you know, may Our Lady keep you and watch over you. But he never told the Protestant, you need to become Catholic right now.
Yeah.
Or what you're thinking isn't the fullness of the faith. Like, he knew his time and his place, and yet he would give his life, literally, for people to be converted. That's basically it. We know then that St. Maximilian was sent to Auschwitz, and he was there from May until July 30th. And on July 30th, he is when he took the place of Franciszek Agnieszek, who was a father and husband, and so he was crying. And the eyewitnesses, it's interesting how many eyewitnesses actually ended up surviving Auschwitz. They have a whole book on it. Eyewitnesses who said that the first miracle, or the miracle of that day, was actually the fact that they didn't shoot St. Maximilian on the spot.
Wow.
Because he got out of line. And then in addition, when he said, I want to exchange places with this man, rather than saying, okay, 11 people are going to die instead of just 10, and you join them if you want to die so badly,
Wow.
they actually let them change places. Like, it was completely against the Nazi logic, but they still did it. Obviously, it was a God moment. St. Maximilian went to the cell, and he was in there for an amazing 2 weeks. And again, eyewitnesses say that the cell, which was usually full of, blaspheming and cursing and groaning and all these things, actually the first few days was full of prayers and singing. And even after they couldn't really have the energy to pray or sing anymore, St. Maximilian was blessing the people as they passed away. And he ultimately, I don't know if he was the only one alive or if there was another person. On the 13th or 14th day, he was still alive, and they wanted the cell. So they gave him a shot of poison, and he died within seconds. And they say that he had a little bit of a smile on his face, and that his whole body actually became, they described it as clean and almost brilliant, rather than contorted in the pain that normally a soul from Auschwitz would die in. St. Maximilian actually died peacefully.